Okay. Good morning. Here's Aries. We're back again. We're now on chapter 2 of Fleeced by Julia Wills. All right there, Aries. We ready? Good. Gosh, well, I don't know about you, but after all that excitement of yesterday, I could do with a decent cup of tea. However, I'll soldier on without a brew, quite parched, so I can tell you about Aries' best friend, Alex. Oh, you've got a best friend called Alex. Alex was a 13-year-old Athenian boy, or at least that's what he's been when he died in ancient Greece and came down to the underworld. Strictly speaking, he was now 2,972 years old. But have you ever seen a birthday cake with that many candles? Whew, don't think so. Gangly with hair as black as ripe olives, he loved being dead. Up on earth, he'd been a potter, spending his days in his grandfather's cool white workshop, painting pot after pot after pot. Round pots, squat pots, pots with bulbous middles, pots with long necks, pots with curly handles that snapped off just as you finished painting the picture on them. But down here, he was a keeper in the underworld zoo, the home to all the old Greek monsters and fabulous animals. A kind of thoughtful boy, Alex's choosing to work in the zoo had been a surprise to his parents, especially to his father, Lycos. During his lifetime, Lycos had been a hoplite in the Athenian army and had nursed hopes that only his son might follow in his footsteps one day into a glorious military career. But Alex, who'd even been named after the greatest army leader of them all, Alexander the Great, couldn't see anything remotely glorious about tramping off on pointless wars, and despite his father's insistence that his son learn to box and throw javelins, Alex had remained uninterested. Alex, you see, was a thinker, not a thumper. Now, as you might imagine, the Underworld Zoo wasn't like any other zoo you or I have ever visited. No penguins skidded down ice slides, no hippopotamuses slapped about in the mud, and absolutely no sea lions ever leapt through a hoop for fish. Instead, the arcades rang with hisses and haws, the slap of tentacles and the clang of bronze beaks. Even that familiar eye-watering whiff you get in Earth zoos was here mingled with the stench of burning earth and vomiting bile. Where are you going, Aries? One enclosure held the ghost of Minotaur, the half-man, half-bull creature who prowled within a high-walled maze beneath a viewing balcony. Another held the spectre of the Cenarian Hide, a deer with golden antlers and hooves made of brass that shot sparks into the air as she scrambled over the rocks. The many-headed Hydra swam in a mesh-covered tank. Wild, man-eating horses galloped around paddocks ringed with high bronze fences. The three Gorgons, women with snakes for hair, bickered behind with special one-way screens to stop their glances turning ghost visitors to stone. What's that? You're surprised that ghost Gorgons could still turn spectators into statues, or that ghost monsters needed locking up at all. I suppose that's because someone's told you that a ghost's just a ghost. It's dead, so it can't be harmful. Well, Greek ghosts are rather different. In fact, they're more like candles. Bright and brilliant, they can spend an eternity in the underworld. But if they're killed a second time, they're snuffed out. Poof! Like an extinguished flame, they vanish in a smoky smudge and become nothing. So the ghost monsters had to be locked up to protect the ghost visitors, or more importantly, as Alex saw it, to protect the monsters. You see, Alex was not a typical Greek hero. He's certainly one of the heroes of our story, and it is a Greek story, but that's not the same thing at all. This is because Greek heroes were famous for two things. Number one, not liking monsters, and number two, killing them. Alex couldn't have been more different. He wouldn't have given you the last week's stale sardines from the bottom of Hydra's tank for a Greek hero. Even now, he couldn't understand why people admired them so much. Of course, it had been the same old story when he was alive. He remembered how customers loved Potts showing Jason sneaking up on Draco, or Harilku's firing arrows at the Harpies. It was stupid, Alex thought, how people swooned over biceps and shiny armour and never once stopped to think what the heroes actually did. Like attacking monsters that simply had been minding their own business. It made him sad to think that every one of the zoo's exhibits was the victim of one hero or another's handiwork, with a sword or a spear or a magic shield. He could imagine the monster's surprise and terror at being attacked and tried to make up for it with kindness now. Which isn't to say he would never ever step into one of their enclosures. Oh no, he understood the monsters and their habits too well to do anything so foolish. After all, habits like tearing people's legs off with your fangs or goring them through the spikes on your tail are harder than most to break. Not that he had to imagine anything when it came to Aries, who told him his opinions on a daily, no, hourly basis. He smiled, wondering what was taking the ram so long at the pavilion this afternoon, and collected the long ladder from the store. Neither a monster nor in the zoo boss's eyes a particularly fabulous animal anymore. Aries hadn't fitted in, and but for Alex's insistence, he would have been abandoned on some Malaisian hillside, anonymous in a shepherd's flock. It was Alex who had stepped in and demanded that he become his assistant. More than that, he'd built him a small white-walled barn in the courtyard of his family's house, despite the protests of his mother and two sisters. Now they too had grown used to sharing their sunlit spot with a ram that they loved even when he chewed the heads off the sunflowers or knocked the arms off the statues with his horns. Late afternoon was Alex's favourite time of the day. The time after the tourists had gone home and he could be alone and feed the monsters. And so, at about the time Aries was splintering the back door of the pavilion, Alex was climbing a ladder propped up against the side of Celia's tank. Scraping away the green weed that floated on the surface of the water with a long pole, he peered down through the iron mesh that covered its surface, just able to make out the sea monster's dark shape against the tiled floor. She looked like a giant backward squid with women's heads fanned out on 6 tentacles that led into a pair of women's shoulders. Further down, several dogs' heads on stalks sprouted from her waist, and from then on she was a silvery fish tail. Pretty she wasn't, but that didn't matter at all, because when Greek sailors saw her rise frothing out of the sea, good looks were the last thing on their minds. Wet knees, splintered ships, rows and rows of gleaming teeth were all much higher up the list, because furious and terrifying, Celia had sunk hundreds of ships and drowned more men than Aries had eaten fresh nettles. Today, however, she lay listless on the pond floor, her tail coiled around her, the dog's heads snoring out bubbles. "Celia!" Alex called down, splashing at the water and tipping in a bucket of sapphire blue fish and dog bones. "I've bought your favourites." He willed the women's eyes to open, for those heads to snake out of the water, for the dogs to bark and snap and keen as she twisted her body into the air before arching down like a pteramine in a storm, sending walls of water over the edges. But she didn't. She didn't do a thing, and the treats sank onto the floor. Feeling worried, Alex slid down the ladder and hurried along the walkway to the stairs, leading to an underground glass-fronted viewing tank for a better look. Squashing his face against the glass, he looked at Celia's downturned mouths and closed eyes. She hadn't looked as miserable as this since the day Heracles had killed her. Hurrying to the next tank of water, which would have appeared uninhabited to you and me, he finally spotted a patch of gently rippling water. Charybdis, the whirlpool, was neither whirling nor pooling. On Earth, she'd kept Celia company, forcing unlucky sailors to choose between being dragged down into her black, spinning waters or being eaten alive by Celia.